Atlantic magazine. Mr. Wood, thank you very much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Let me begin by asking you, how important is this trip in the context of a dramatically changing region? Could it be, do you think, a game changer for U.S. policy, something that people in the region can finally believe in?
I think it's very early to say that it would be a game changer. What we do know is that the United States needs to make a really floor-to-ceiling change in the way that it interacts with governments in the region. And it requires a visit from someone of the stature of a Hillary Clinton to actually make those contacts and make the revisions that would be necessary.
So do you think in the medium to long term that it may be an opportunity to articulate perhaps something that is new, something that is fresh, and something that is certainly bold, based on perhaps treating the region, or at least approaching people in the region as equals, affording them the same kind of respect that the United States shows its Western allies, rather than a relationship, you know, that's based on inducements which patently have not worked in the past?
Yes, what you say about inducements is exactly right. What has happened in the past has been, we see this from the WikiLeaks cables, that the United States has tried to pressure, for example, Mubarak or Ben Ali to reduce corruption, to democratize faster, but it hasn't happened. So what we have to see from Clinton in this trip is a changing of the framework to see whether there is a new way of working with these governments that the United States can come up with.
But what would that framework be, do you think? I mean, I'm just going back to, you know, that man that stood up in Cairo, President Obama, when he addressed that crowd there in Cairo, was that just rhetoric? Was it just another fine speech by the President of the United States?
Well, what we do know is that it was more or less irrelevant to what happened last month in Cairo, which is a strange thing. The United States was a very important ally of Mubarak and had very close ties with Mubarak. So if the United States was, as the cables seem to show, very intent on seeing democratization and change in the government there, then exactly what kind of change will happen in a new framework is unclear. But we know that these minor, gradual inducements were not what actually created the change that the people of Egypt seem very happy to have seen.
So just very briefly, do you think we're looking at the status quo certainly in the short to medium term, perhaps even in the long term, we don't know, or will it be something that is kind of more gradualist, and the United States has its approach of taking it country by country, seeing what happens, and then being pragmatic?
I think that it will be more gradual than a very quick change. We see such a failure in U.S. diplomacy to cause the democratic change that you can't expect the United States very quickly to pivot and to be able to advocate or to partner with democratic movements in the way that turned out to be effective in Cairo. So you would have to see that kind of change happen in a greater time span.
All right, Graham Wood, contributing editor at The Atlantic magazine, thank you very much for joining us there from Boston. That's it from the team in Washington. I'll be back with more news a little later on in the program. Now it's back to Laura in Doha.
Security forces in Saudi Arabia have opened fire during a protest by around 200 people in the country's east. The Saudi Interior Ministry says 2 protesters and a policeman were injured, but it insists officers only fired into the air. Opponents of the Saudi government have used the internet to call for bigger protests on Friday. More now from Bernard Smith.
A second day of protests in the eastern Saudi Arabian city of Qatif. This footage is from YouTube and apparently shot on Thursday, although it can't be independently verified. What sounds like the crackle of gunfire comes from the distance. Saudi police are reported to have opened fire to disperse the crowd. At least 2 people were injured. This restive region is home to mainly Shia Muslims. Neighbouring Bahrain is 70% Shia and has been racked by weeks of protests. These scenes are just the sort of contagion feared by Saudi Arabia's Sunni Muslim leaders. And so, in a region where most rulers have extremely deep pockets, the Gulf Cooperation Council has decided to try and buy itself out of trouble. Bahrain and Oman are to benefit from a multi-billion-dollar aid package from their richer neighbours.
$10 billion for the Kingdom of Bahrain and $10 billion for the Sultanate of Oman. We believe that this is an ambitious program, but it also shows the strong support that comes from the GCC countries to the Sultanate of Oman and to the Kingdom of Bahrain.
In protests in Qatif on Wednesday, the crowd chanted "Down with the regime" and "No Sunni, no Shia, we are Muslim." But the Saudi Sunni leadership is deeply suspicious of the role of Shia powerhouse Iran. There is a call for protests across Saudi Arabia on Friday, despite an official ban. Witnesses in the capital, Riyadh, say riot police have started patrolling around shopping malls and main roads. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera.
Yemen's opposition has rejected President Saleh's offer to create a parliamentary system. It also promised to prepare a constitution for referendum by the end of this year. But opponents say it's an attempt to hold on to power rather than a genuine call for change. Hashim Al-Habara reports from Sana'a.
It's a parliamentary promise aimed at ending Yemen's long-running political stalemate, but it's already received a rough response.
A committee will be formed to draft a new constitution based on separation powers. A referendum on the changes will be held by the end of this year. 2, we will move to a parliamentary system where all the executive powers will be transferred to the government, which will be elected by the parliament by the end of 2011. We will also put in place a decentralized political and administrative system.
The proposals follow previous concessions, including a pledge by the president to stand down in 2 years. Those too were rejected. But President Saleh's advisors stressed the historic nature of what's on offer.
I think this is an unprecedented announcement, and it's unique almost in the Arab world that the presidential system existing today will become a parliamentary system where the prime minister, who is elected by the people, will become the executive authority, and he will become 100% responsible to parliament and all actions he does.
That didn't impress Yemen's opposition parties, who still insist on the president's immediate resignation.
The president's statement is merely empty words in an attempt to escape the crisis. We call on the president to come up with an initiative defining his view of the so-called peaceful transition in order for him to leave.
So the daily protests in Sana'a's University Square are likely to continue. The demonstrators believe President Saleh's downfall is just a matter of time.
The president says he's offering radical reforms. The opposition says it's just a publicity stunt. Each is holding